The scent of freshly cut grass always brings me back to Springfield, the small town where I spent my formative years and still call home. It's a quiet place, or at least it was back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when life moved at a slightly slower pace. My name is Evelyn, and I'm 35 now, but some memories from those days are as vivid as if they happened yesterday. Especially the ones involving Mr. Henderson and his pristine, almost unnervingly perfect lawn. Our corner of Springfield was a patchwork of neat, modest houses, each with its own small patch of green. We weren't wealthy, but we had a sense of community, a shared understanding of what it meant to be good neighbors. That understanding, however, didn't extend to Mr. Henderson. He lived 2 houses down from mine, directly across the street from the Miller family, who were some of the kindest, most salt-of-the-earth people you could ever hope to meet. I knew Joe and his family through a series of local online forums that were popular back then, early versions of what we now call social media, but much simpler, often just text-based bulletin board systems where folks would chat about everything from local politics to gardening tips. Joe and his wife, Clara, were pillars of that online community, often hosting gatherings at their house, potlucks that spilled out into their backyard, filled with laughter and the clatter of plastic plates. Their 3 kids, all teenagers then, were good kids, too. They weren't involved in drugs or drinking, they focused on their schoolwork, and they were always polite. My own path hadn't crossed theirs much in the hallways of Springfield High, a few years separating our graduating classes, but I felt a connection to them through Joe and Clara. The Millers' driveway was, understandably, a busy place. With 2 adults and 3 teenagers all driving, it was rare for all their cars to fit comfortably. So it was a common sight for one of the kids, usually their oldest son, Mark, to park his beat-up sedan on the street directly in front of their house, or sometimes just a little further down, right in front of Mr. Henderson's. It was perfectly legal, a public street, but to Mr. Henderson, it was an egregious offense. Mr. Henderson was a man of routines and rigid expectations. He was in his late 50s then, always impeccably dressed, even when he was just out watering his lawn. And oh, that lawn, it was his masterpiece, his obsession. Every blade seemed to stand at attention, perfectly uniform, a vibrant, almost artificial green. You could spot him out there most evenings, meticulously inspecting it, as if searching for a rogue dandelion, a single blade out of place. He'd yell at kids for riding their bikes too close to the curb, at people walking their dogs if the slightest paw print dared to touch his manicured turf. He was the kind of neighbor who saw every minor infraction as a personal attack. His biggest pet peeve, however, seemed to be noise and anything that disrupted his visual order. The Millers, despite being a family of 5, were not loud people. Yet, Mr. Henderson would call the police regularly with noise complaints, even when the only sound coming from their house was the faint hum of a television. And then there were the cars. He would call the police repeatedly, reporting Mark's car as an abandoned vehicle, knowing full well it belonged to the Millers and would be gone by morning, heading off to school or work. Each time, the police would arrive, sometimes with a polite knock on the Millers' door, sometimes just giving the car a cursory glance before leaving, clearly exasperated themselves. It was a constant, low-level war, one that Joe and Clara endured with a patience I couldn't quite fathom. I often saw Joe standing on his porch, a weary sigh escaping him as the police cruiser pulled away, shaking his head slowly. I felt for them. It was a clear abuse of the system, a petty act of power by a man who seemed to thrive on making others uncomfortable. The problem, despite the Millers' quiet resilience, only escalated. Mr. Henderson seemed to revel in his role as the neighborhood enforcer. The police, while understanding of the situation, couldn't actually stop him from making calls as long as he claimed to perceive a legitimate issue. The Millers tried to be accommodating, shuffling cars around, but it was like trying to contain water with a sieve. There were 5 drivers, only 2 garage spots and a small driveway. Something had to give. The stress of it was palpable, even from my house. I'd see Clara looking worn, Joe's shoulders hunched a little more each day. It was a slow drip of irritation, but it was relentless. One sweltering afternoon, I watched from my living room window as Mark pulled his car onto the street, exactly where he usually did. Not even 5 minutes later, Mr. Henderson emerged from his house, a scowl etched onto his face, and began a slow, deliberate walk toward the vehicle. He didn't touch it, but he circled it, his head tilted, as if cataloging its imperfections. He then marched straight to his own front door, and moments later, I saw him on his landline phone, undoubtedly dialing the non-emergency police number again. It was a performance, a deliberate display of his displeasure, and it left a sour taste in my mouth. Joe, who had been watering his plants, simply lowered his hose, his face a mask of profound exhaustion. A few weeks later, Joe came to me. He found me out in my own small garden, trying to coax some reluctant tomatoes into ripening. He shuffled his feet a bit, looking uncomfortable. "Evelyn," he started, his voice a low rumble, "I don't know what else to do about Henderson. He's driving us crazy. The kids are getting fed up." Mark almost missed an exam because he was worried about getting a ticket for parking near Henderson's house. We've tried talking to him, we've tried ignoring him, we've even offered to buy him a shrub to block the view of the street from his living room window, but he just glares. Joe's frustration was a heavy cloak around him. He explained how he'd called the police station himself, trying to explain the situation from their perspective, but they'd basically told him their hands were tied. "He's not breaking any laws by making the calls, Joe," they'd said, "and your son's car isn't illegally parked. It's a neighbor dispute." A neighbor dispute that was eroding the peace of their home. I listened intently, my gardening gloves still on, my brow furrowed. I suggested common approaches, a neighborhood mediation service, perhaps sending a polite letter from a lawyer outlining their legal right to park on the public street. Joe shook his head. "We tried all that. He just tears up the letters, says we're harassing him. He's got an answer for everything, and it always circles back to us being the problem." My own attempts to offer conventional solutions felt hollow. We were good people, trapped in a cycle of harassment by a man who thrived on being difficult. My lowest point came not long after that conversation, a turning point that shifted my passive sympathy into something far more active. My girlfriend at the time, Sarah, was visiting for the weekend. We were heading out for dinner, and she, being unfamiliar with the peculiar battlefield that was Mr. Henderson's lawn, stepped out of my car and, in her natural stride, allowed her foot to briefly touch the very edge of his immaculate grass as she moved to the sidewalk. It was barely a transgression, a mere brush of a shoe against a blade. But Mr. Henderson, as if summoned by some invisible signal, burst out of his front door. "Hey, you, get off my lawn." He shrieked, his voice piercing the quiet evening air. Sarah froze, startled, a polite apology already forming on her lips. "I'm so sorry," she began, but he cut her off. "Sorry isn't good enough. Do you know how much work goes into this? This isn't a public footpath. Have some respect." His face was contorted in a sneer, his finger wagging furiously. Sarah, a kind and gentle soul, looked utterly mortified. I stepped forward, my own patience wearing thin. "Mr. Henderson, it was an accident. She barely touched it." He turned his venom on me then. "Oh, it's you, Evelyn, always defending these hooligans. You're just as bad as those Millers, letting your friends disrespect the neighborhood." That was it. That was the moment. My jaw tightened, a cold anger replacing my usual calm. It wasn't just about Joe and Clara anymore. It was personal. This man, this petty tyrant, had crossed a line. He had deliberately humiliated someone I cared about, someone who had done absolutely nothing to deserve his wrath. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. All the conventional avenues had been exhausted. Reason, politeness, even the law, seemed to bend to his unreasonable will. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated frustration, a desperate need for some kind of balance, some form of quiet justice. As I drove Sarah to dinner, her earlier mortification giving way to a quiet fury of her own, my mind raced. I kept replaying Henderson's rant, his obsessive focus on his lawn. His lawn, that was his weakness. That was his Achilles heel. And then an idea, a tiny seed of mischief, began to sprout in my mind. It was a thought that blossomed into a plan so beautifully simple, so perfectly tailored to his particular brand of misery, that I almost chuckled aloud. Crabgrass. I spent the next few days doing my research, not on the internet. It was still too rudimentary for this kind of specific information, but at the local library, poring over gardening books and old agricultural journals. Crabgrass, I learned, was the bane of every lawn enthusiast's existence. It was an annual weed, true, but it spread like wildfire, especially in warm, moist conditions. And once it took root, it was a nightmare to get rid of, its seeds lying dormant for years, just waiting for the right conditions to germinate. Back then, there weren't the easy, targeted chemical sprays we have now. You had to dig it out manually, painstakingly, or use harsh herbicides that often damaged the surrounding good grass. The challenge was finding the seeds without raising suspicion. I didn't want to just walk into the hardware store and ask for a bag of crabgrass. So I went to a few different garden supply stores in the next town over, buying small packets of various grass seeds, and then, under the guise of starting a new wildflower patch, I managed to buy a small bag of crabgrass seed, discreetly labeled as hardy ground cover or something equally misleading. The sales clerk barely glanced at it. The plan was meticulously crafted. It needed rain, and it needed darkness. I watched the weather forecasts like a hawk, waiting for a night when a steady, gentle rain was predicted, the kind that would soak into the soil, creating the perfect environment for germination. And then I waited. One Tuesday evening, just after midnight, the heavens opened. Not a torrential downpour, but a soft, persistent drizzle. Perfect. I pulled on a dark jacket and a pair of old sneakers. My own dog, a scruffy terrier mix named Gus who usually snored contentedly at the foot of my bed, looked at me with confusion as I roused him. "Come on, boy," I whispered, attaching his leash. "Time for a midnight stroll." Gus, bless his innocent heart, was always up for an adventure. I had the bag of crabgrass seed tucked into my pocket, divided into smaller, more manageable pouches for easy access. My heart hammered in my chest, a mix of nerves and exhilarating anticipation. This wasn't just revenge, it was an act of artistic justice. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows as Gus and I began our walk. I made sure to take the long way around, circling the block once before approaching Mr. Henderson's house. The rain was cold on my face, but it felt cleansing, almost like a blessing for my mission. As we neared his lawn, I slowed my pace. Gus, sensing my tension, gave a soft whimper and looked up at me. "Quiet, boy," I murmured, stroking his head. His perfectly manicured lawn, usually so starkly defined, looked a little softer, a little more vulnerable under the rain. I pretended to let Gus sniff around a particularly interesting patch of grass near the curb, my hand casually dipping into my pocket. With subtle, almost imperceptible movements, I began to scatter the tiny, almost invisible seeds. A pinch here, a light sprinkle there. I focused on the edges, the pathways, the areas where someone might inadvertently step, the places where his perfection was most aggressively asserted. I walked slowly, allowing Gus to tug gently on his leash, giving me the cover I needed. I even veered slightly onto the actual lawn, my footfalls silent on the wet grass, scattering a wider pattern, making sure it wasn't just concentrated in one spot. I imagined the seeds sinking into the damp earth, finding purchase, waiting. The rain would wash them deeper, disguising my work perfectly. My heart rate soared, but I maintained a steady, casual pace, as if this were just any other late-night dog walk. It felt illicit, thrilling, and profoundly right. The process took about 15 minutes. By the time Gus and I circled back to my house, the rain had begun to ease and a thin mist hung in the air. I let out a long, slow breath, a smile touching my lips. Now, all that was left was to wait. Crabgrass needed warmth and time. Weeks passed, and I kept my eyes peeled. Joe and Clara still dealt with the occasional police visit, but the pressure seemed to have lessened slightly, perhaps because Mr. Henderson was growing distracted. Then, slowly, subtly, I started to notice it. First, it was just a slight discoloration, a patch of grass that seemed a little off, a different shade of green, slightly coarser texture. Then, as the spring warmth really settled in, the patches grew larger, more distinct. It was glorious. About 6 weeks after that rainy night, I was driving by the miller's house and my jaw almost dropped. Holy cow. Mr. Henderson's front lawn was a mess. It wasn't just a few patches. It was a chaotic tapestry of dark green, broad-leafed crabgrass. Big islands of it erupted everywhere, streaks of it marred the once perfect uniformity, and ugly, coarse patches stood out like festering wounds. It was like a map of my midnight walk, a botanical rebellion. I pulled over, unable to resist the spectacle. And there he was, Mr. Henderson, down on his hands and knees, in the middle of his ruined lawn, a small hand trowel clutched in his white-knuckled fist. He was digging out clumps of the wretched weed, his face beet red, sweat plastering his hair to his forehead. He looked utterly defeated, a man whose entire world had been thrown into disarray by a few thousand tiny seeds. I watched for a moment, an immense wave of quiet satisfaction washing over me. This wasn't just physical damage, it was psychological. His perfection, his control had been utterly obliterated. Later that day, I saw Joe out mowing his own lawn, a small smile playing on his lips. He caught my eye and gave a subtle nod, a shared secret passing between us. "He's been out there for hours every day," Joe confided, his voice low, "trying everything." Sprays, digging, even hired a landscaper who just shook his head and told him it was pretty widespread. They said he's going to have to dig out whole sections and reseed. And even then, crabgrass is a pain. It'll probably keep popping up for years. I felt a quiet, deep sense of victory. Justice, in its own unique and botanical way, had been served. The immediate threat to the Millers had subsided, replaced by Mr. Henderson's personal, never-ending battle with his lawn. Life in Springfield settled back into its usual rhythm. The parking situation for the Millers became a non-issue. Mr. Henderson was too preoccupied with his verdant nemesis to care about anything else. He still lived there for many years, but his once pristine lawn never quite recovered its former glory. It became a permanent reminder of his small-mindedness and the consequences of pushing good people too far. He eventually moved away, though I never found out where. I heard through the grapevine that the new owners had inherited a lawn with some serious personality, a legacy of his long-forgotten battle. Joe passed away several years ago, quietly in his sleep. I didn't find out until much later, and I still miss him. He was a quiet guy, just as I remembered him, and a genuinely good person who simply wanted peace for his family. His wife, Clara, has since moved out of state with one of their kids and his family, starting a new chapter. Good people, the Millers. The world truly needs more like them. And sometimes, it needs just a little bit of crabgrass to remind us that even the smallest acts of defiance can create the biggest impact. I still drive by that house sometimes, and even now, 2 decades later, if I look closely enough, I think I can still spot a rogue blade or two of that wonderfully persistent weed, standing tall and defiant, a quiet testament to a very satisfying victory.